Governing Security, The Hidden Origins of American Security Agencies is the name of the book. The author is a professor of political science at Stanford, and that's Mariano-Florentino Cuellar. Professor Cuellar, what is the Federal Security Agency, and does it still exist?
That's a terrific question. I had the same question myself when I first came across it. Let me give you a little bit of context. I first came across that name in a very old U.S. government manual that I had in my hands. It was dusty with dust from the library, clearly indicating no one had taken it out of the library for probably many years. And I saw that name staring back at me, Federal Security Agency, and I thought, this is troubling to me because I think of myself as an expert in administrative law and the government of the U.S., and I have never heard of this agency. So as I investigated the agency, I discovered two important and interesting things about it. One is that Roosevelt staked a huge amount of political capital to get the legal authority from Congress to create that agency.
FDR.
FDR. And then the other is that that agency had a quirky list of responsibilities that cut across a lot of domains that we currently segregate. So on the one hand, you could see the agency being very involved in education policy. It had responsibility for food safety. It dealt with social welfare, social security, employment placement. It dealt with civilian defense. It had a division dealing with biological weapons research. It helped the military prepare for emergencies. And so if you look at all these responsibilities together, you realize this was an agency that was meant to be about protecting Americans from risk at home, but also protecting Americans from the risk of attack and protecting Americans from the possible dangers of war. So what that agency is the structure from which evolved an agency called the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, and today we know it as the Department of Health and Human Services. So a version of it, the descendant of it, is still around today.
When was FSA formed, and was there a fight between Congress and the President to establish it?
Congress and the President fought long and hard over the matter of what power could the President have to reorganize the executive branch. If you look at the newspapers from the day, you'd see cartoons of Roosevelt trying to pry loose from Congress this great authority, and people argued about it in the newspaper and in radio programs. The question was whether the powers to reorganize government were a normal thing that the President should be able to use to make the government more efficient, more streamlined, more cost-effective, or whether it was a giant step in the direction of making Roosevelt more like a dictator. So Roosevelt and Congress had a big fight right around the same time that Congress and the President fought over court reorganization, what we now call court packing. And interestingly enough, when Roosevelt realized that his court packing plan was not going anywhere, he backed down on that front, but he did not back down with respect to fighting for authority to reorganize the federal government. Once he had that authority in 1939, the first thing he did was he created this Federal Security Agency. And there's an important piece of historical context here, which is that Roosevelt had been fighting with Congress not only over authority to reorganize the government in general, but over authority to create a Ministry of Health, a Secretary of Health, right? At the time, Congress said no, and Roosevelt had to accept some limits on his authority to reorganize the government. He had to justify every piece of any reorganization on the basis of money saved. He couldn't create a new cabinet agency. Nonetheless, Roosevelt set in motion a process that went from this sort of early agency called the Federal Security Agency into a department, cabinet-level department that dealt with health issues.
What is the picture that you have on the front of your book governing security?
So this is a person who is applying for unemployment assistance and who is getting help from the Federal Security Agency and finding a new job. And it's a reminder that this agency has created a really critical juncture in American history where the country has not yet gotten through the Great Depression, but Roosevelt is already looking towards what might be big foreign entanglement, the possibility of war. So as this person is going about his business, trying to figure out what comes next in his life, trying to get some assistance from the federal government to find a new job, what's happening in the background is that Roosevelt is having a different fight with Congress, not only the one I mentioned already over executive reorganization, but a fight over what's going to happen with all these social welfare efforts that he's tried to get off the ground. Now, other people have written about how Social Security and federal relief efforts were not happening in a vacuum. There had been disaster assistance in the past. But Roosevelt did a whole lot to move that agenda forward, a great deal, by creating the Social Security Bureau, among other things, creating the FDA to deal with risk regulation. And so the question was, what might happen to all those agencies if the U.S. government went to war? And one of the challenges for Roosevelt at the time that picture was taken is that not everybody felt great about the U.S. possibly getting involved in some kind of foreign entanglement. There was a strong tradition of isolationism in the country. And so there were some members of Congress who were trying to put Roosevelt between a rock and a hard place because they knew that he wanted to get the U.S. closer to a war footing, that he wanted to help our allies, particularly the United Kingdom, that he was looking to see what might happen in the Pacific. And they also knew that he wanted to protect his social welfare program. So the pressure was on Roosevelt to essentially choose whether to use the federal government's capacity and resources to build up the country's defenses, to prepare for a possible war, or to protect his social welfare programs. And what he did, in a sense, was to create a super agency that could blur the distinction between these two agendas and therefore move forward on both goals at the same time.
Well, Professor Cuellar, speaking of super agencies, there's another one that was created in the OOs by President Bush that you write about in here. Whose idea was DHS?
Well before the 9/11 attacks, there were national commissions, there were university professors that talked about the importance of better coordination to protect the country from attacks from non-state actors, from terrorism, maybe to protect the country's borders more effectively. But the actual process of creating a cabinet agency was one that really reflected, again, this interplay of forces that included members of Congress fighting to create the agency in a particular way, but also the president, who had a big, big role in this process. So it's important to note that in the first instance, the idea for a Department of Homeland Security did not originate in the White House. This is part of what got me interested in this whole subject. What do presidents want? Why do they create these agencies? What are they trying to achieve? And what I found was that in the very early days after the 9/11 attacks, understandably enough, the president and his advisors were focused on crisis response. They were focused on just trying to make things work effectively. And when members of Congress or others suggested there ought to be a super department to bring together these different functions under one cabinet agency, they were a little skittish about that. They said, look, we've created a new White House office to coordinate these things. It's not obvious that we need a new department to be created. But the groundswell of interest in Congress forced the president's hand a bit. And eventually it was very difficult for him to say no. So at that point, the White House role shifted from being quite cautious about it to taking ownership of the situation and trying to create the department along the lines that might make the most sense for the White House. So in that respect, I would say, although the original idea was not the White House's, the final design very much reflected the imprimatur of the White House.
Mariano-Florentino Cuellar is the author of this book, Governing Security, The Hidden Origins of American Security Agencies. How much overlap did the creation of a super department such as DHS or FSA create in the federal government?
It's ironic that in both cases, the idea behind the creation of these agencies was to reduce overlap, to create efficiencies. But one of the things I talk about in the book is that you have this very hard choice when you're putting together a government agency. By unifying certain functions, you disunify other functions. I'll give you an example from DHS, and then I'll give you an example from the FSA. So with DHS, plainly, it might make sense to put the Transportation Security Agency in a security agency. But in doing so, you separate it from the Federal Aviation Administration, from the Secretary of Transportation, from all these functions that otherwise involve aviation. With the FSA, it was very important for Roosevelt that the Food and Drug Administration be transferred from the Agriculture Department to this new super agency. Some of Roosevelt's advisors felt like that new structure that would be created at the FSA might be more amenable to the functions of the FDA, to protecting Americans from unsafe food and regulating the pharmaceutical industry, than being in an agency that was focused on, in some respects, promoting the interests of the agriculture industry. And yet, of course, by separating the FDA from the Department of Agriculture, you create this question, which is, how much does the FDA really know about farming? And does it make sense to give the FDA the authority to protect people from unsafe food, even if that involves lots of technical decisions that involve American farming. And those debates